Hey guys, Tempest here. Just a friendly Canadian reminder to keep force buying, and you're watching Thorn's YouTube.
Okay, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and this one is going to be with Archie, the old school player from the Eyeballers clan, most famously CPL champion. Got an interesting career to unpack here. So, okay, if we go back in time, one of the interesting things I thought about your team and like the era when you came up is, even though I say they're like old school, the problem is people who were actually at the beginning of Counter-Strike, you're not an old school player. You were coming along a couple of generations later, because, you know, there really were people going to tournaments in like 2001. And obviously Sweden had already established itself in Counter-Strike. It had Heaton and Potty and guys like this, where they had the NIP, and then obviously SK Gaming, which eventually your team became a rival of. So were you someone who actually started at the beginning of Counter-Strike? Like, when did the competitive side start to come along for you?
I think I started with Counter-Strike in like beta, I don't know, 5.6 or maybe 6.0, something like that. That would be somewhere around when I was 13 or 14. So that's around 2002, maybe, something like that. And I kind of figured out that I was pretty good at this game quite early, actually. And we had a lot of CS players in my town. I live in a pretty small town, but there were a lot of players playing LAN.
Are there any really famous ones from your town?
No, I wouldn't say. There were like a good Quake 3 player back then.
Okay.
But no Counter-Strike player, I wouldn't say. But we kind of formed quite early, like the all-star team locally, and there were like a few local LANs each year where this local team went, and we kind of crushed the opponents each time. So I guess pretty early, maybe like 1 year in to Counter-Strike, I was playing with the best team in my part of Sweden, the southern part, I guess.
Okay. Were some of the players then who went on to be in the frontline team, which became Eyeballers, were any of them from your town?
No. We had, I don't know if you want to go into that right now, but we had Eyeballers went to one of our local events, basically, to challenge us. And that was the first time we lost. So I think that's where they spot me. I didn't start playing with Eyeballers until later, but I think that's where they kind of recognized Archie as the name, I guess.
Okay. Because this is one of the things I've always been interested in the Swedish scene. It's actually something I was trying to explain to people in the modern day, but they don't understand, because they all think, right, that when you become a good player, like no one really stops and thinks about like, how do you get from being a player who has talent but no one knows yet to being in the pro team? Like that jump is key, because in the future, like think about how American sports work. They have like a structure the whole way. You're in high school, then you play in college, and you go to the NBA or whatever. Like they have a whole structure to scout people, to get the next talent, to figure out who's good, who's not. But in Counter-Strike, one of the things people don't know about why Sweden was always very strong is because, in English, the term is grassroots community. Like you start from nothing, it's fun, and then you have small lands, and then you have the more competitive ones. And so one of the things I know early on when you got with the frontline guys was, your team actually, I think, should be considered one of the success stories of that Swedish esport league. Because for people who don't know, the concept was, in like the early days of Counter-Strike, they had a thing called the Swedish Esport League, and the whole concept was, since Sweden was built on this LAN cafe culture, they made it so that since the internet already is amazing in Sweden, and obviously the cafes are all on like the backbone connections that are really good, they were like, right, what we'll do is we'll have an online league, but you have to play from the LAN cafe. So first of all, it's very unlikely you're going to cheat, because you sat in a LAN cafe where people could see you. And then the idea is, at the time, it was kind of modeling off like traditional sports. So, there's a team in Stockholm in this area, and there's a team in Gothenburg and Malmö, it's that kind of a concept. It was quite an interesting idea. But the funny thing is, when it started, a lot of people like me and others were very cynical, because we were just like, right, well, to be fair, there's only 2 or 3 Swedish teams that actually can like go to a CPL and win it, So what we all thought was, well, they're just going to pick their cafe. So, like SK might be at Inferno Online or something. And then those teams are just going to win this esport league. And whoever's at the bottom of this league is going to be terrible. And it's going to be a waste of everyone's time because who gives a fuck about those guys? But actually, you know what? I've got to say, this actually showed me why it's important to have that structure where people can test themselves. Because very quickly into this league, you had teams who you didn't know that well, or they hadn't gone to the big international tournaments, who were already having results, Like obviously a guy who later became a teammate of yours, Hyper, he was in that Highland Online team that rose up and they actually were winning the Swedish Esport League. Then your team came along and again, your team didn't have known players in, these guys hadn't been at SK or Team 9 or anything, but you were coming decent placings. This is before you got your best lineup. So what was that one of your first experiences of like the professional level of Counter-Strike, being able to play the SK Gamings of the world?
Trying to remember, but I guess that was the first big thing, I think, the Swedish Esport League. We had played some tournaments before then. I don't know exactly when was this exactly.
I think it was like 2003.
2003. I guess the ECWC qualifier was played before then.
Yes.
And that was our first. That was in Stockholm, and that was our first event. I think as a team we played online a lot, but not on an event, and that was our first. And we came fourth, I think. And later on, we actually got the third spot because some team couldn't go. I didn't attend that event though because I was too young, but the other guys did. So my first, big event kind of was the Swedish Esports League, I think. And I remember that you needed to be 3 guys on the cafe and 2 could play from home.
Right. Okay.
And this was in the town called Halmstad, and I was closest to Halmstad. It's like 1.5 hour, something like that. So I was almost always one of the players that was on the cafe. And I don't remember exactly, the group stage of it, but I remember the finals, and I remember that we were kind of close to beating SK, I think. I think we came from loser bracket. No, maybe not. Yeah, I don't know. We were kind of close. We kind of got the feel that we could measure ourselves versus them. So that was the start of just feeling like we were becoming the second best team in Sweden, I think.
Okay. Were you actually someone who at the time was, aside from playing, did you follow the esports side of things? Like if there was a CPL or one of these big tournaments, did you watch it? Yeah,
I did, for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the key strengths or key what you should say, a key I watched a lot of demos when I was starting out. I did that not as much as I played, but I watched a few demos each day of the better players. And I did that until I was at the very top level, and then I kind of slowed it down a little bit. Unfortunately, I think you should still keep on doing that, but that's what I did to become more aware of what I needed to work on. So I did that, and I followed the events as well. I don't know if there was such a good observer mode back then. Sure. So I guess I put more time into the individual demos, but yeah, for sure, I swallowed everything that had to do with Counter-Strike, for sure.
Did you have like a player who you thought had the best style or you admired?
I kind of I need to I don't think it was any of the star players in SK. Sure. Maybe Fisker. I kind of liked Fisker's play style a lot. I think he's kind of one of the most underestimated players during our era. Okay. But I just checked everything out. I think no particular player. I was pretty self-confident back then too, because me and vilden especially, we got a lot of doubt online, so that kind of built up our confidence. And that was from the very top players in Counter-Strike back then. Until we actually showed up at LAN, we got a lot of doubt online. So I kind of had high hopes for myself quite early, I think.
Sure.
But I was kind of, still still realizing that I, needed to improve to become the best, I think. So that's why I checked out all these demos all the time.
Okay. So the guys who were in this team, as you say, like they had like a core together, they picked you up, right? What was great about this team is, as I referenced earlier, it was a team where the whole kind of crew was coming up together and was becoming a much better and getting near the top level and then making, the key roster moves to like get the right players. So can you give me some insight into some of these players? Because, okay, like people are going to know, for example, vilden. He did go on to other things after this team, was obviously a very famous player in his own right. But some of the other people maybe aren't actually very well known. Like maybe people don't know someone like GudeN or CRW or something like this. So who were these guys?
Yeah, so GudeN, who was he was the most experienced player in our team, actually. I don't know if we should start with Payne and Kolol, because the first lineup was Payne, Kolol, yes, GudeN, me, and vilden. That was how it started out. Payne was one of the founders of Eyeballers, I think. He was in there from the very beginning. So was Kolol, and they both came from the city Jönköping, where vilden is living.
Sure, where DreamHack is. Yeah,
exactly. So that's how they kind of, they only had 2 hours down to where I live, and that was where the first LAN event where they kind of noticed me. So that's why they were there. Payne, I don't know. Payne was, I guess he was. I don't know if he didn't. He attended the ECWC, but then he was kind of gone after that. Kolol, I think, kind of quit even earlier than that. So GudeN, who was one of the core players, he was probably the guy that challenged vilden the most in terms of the strategic part of Counter-Strike. Okay. He always question vilden in terms of how we should kind of map out our game. Focused on team play, took out what he needed to, I guess. Pretty strategically sound and a team player for sure. CRW, kind of more like a support player, I think. More like pretty solid fragger. Not that tactically developed, I don't think. Still understood the game well. Pretty good game sense. Not a mad fragger, but a pretty solid player, I think. That's and Hyper and vilden is more known, I guess. And IsKall.
What about this guy Bevah then? Because I know he was like in the team briefly, and then he did that like weird comeback later that didn't work out. So who was that guy? Sorry,
what name did you say?
Bevah.
Bevah, yeah, Bevah. Yeah, Bevah is also from the southern part of Sweden. He had also played the game a lot. He played Counter-Strike. He's a few years older than me. He had played in some pretty decent teams. The thing was that I think he would actually be on CPL with us if he didn't decide to go into the military. That's why he disappeared. He went into the military and he was there pretty long. I think he were there at least 1.5 years. Some only get 12 months, but he got at least 1.5 years, maybe even 2 years. And after that, we tried to introduce him to the team again, but he had been gone for too long. So he wasn't the type of player that he was before. But that is, I think Bevah represents he would be a very valuable player today in terms of he understood the concept of team play way earlier than most people, I think. He was just a core team player, good at comms, good strategically, a decent fragger. He had everything to become like one of the core players in a star team today, I think.
Because the interesting thing is, like I referenced earlier, it's not as though your team came along and then it was just that, they've got players like Hyper and vilden and, these guys are like star players and like they're winning just because they've got, like, that's what happens sometimes, a team rises up because of specific players.
Yes.
But as you're kind of alluding to here, even though at the time, because it's in the early days of Counter-Strike still, there still were a lot of teams that just had, like, for obviously one of the secrets to why the SK Gamings of the world always stayed on top is they always recruited the right players. You know, they made sure they did get all the star players and have really strong individual players. But I actually can understand why some teams who played against them were like, it was so difficult to face them, because on the one hand, they didn't always have the best team player. They definitely didn't always have the best tactics. I know that, because, you know, sometimes they didn't have a proper in-game leader, even they had someone just doing it temporarily, you know. And the point is, they could beat anyone because maybe they had the best player in the world, or they had the best all-pro, whatever, you know, whatever thing you could have. But this is like the era I noticed when some teams started to actually put more focus onto communication and specific, like the idea is like, if you execute a tactic the right way, you don't need the best players necessarily. You just need the person who can do that job, right?
Yep.
So was your team just having to learn all this from scratch? Was watching demos helping? How did you kind of develop this team play aspect?
So first of all, I think I agree with everything you said there. But I guess, you know, for a team like us to still succeed, we need some baseline of individual skill, right? So I think we had 3 out of 5 players in terms of that could measure with SK, maybe something like that. We didn't have, you know, we couldn't be 5 versus 5 in terms of individual skill. Of course not, but maybe 2 or 3 players could measure up, I think. So, but the way we learned tactics, I think, I'm not sure my teammates will agree with this, especially not vilden, but I remembered it as that. First of all, vilden, all the players were pretty, you know, had understood the concept that we could do more with tactics, but vilden was the brain around it, you know. But we also got some insights from how Kaya worked. I don't know if you remember that team. Hyper played there in the ECWC qualifier. They were pretty lousy in terms of individual skill, I think, if you compare versus the very best in Sweden. Okay. But they kind of had some success anyway, because they were always playing 2 by 2 or 2 or 3. They were always close together, you know, and they were always very slow. They played very, very, very extremely slow. Because they had something lined up that they wanted to follow, and they were kind of the first team that I saw that used specific tactics that were more than basic tactics, more than like a split on D2. They were, you know, they had some type of thought into where they should throw their grenades, which timing they should use and stuff like that. So I think we got some insight from that when Hyper came along, and then it was brought together with the brain of vilden and the concept he wanted, and also backed up by me and GudeN, for example.
Okay. What kind of player were you then? Like, how would you describe your skill set, or what do you think your role was in the team?
Since we had Hyper and vilden, which is kind of big personalities, both of them, and that's kind of shows off in game too, because they're quite aggressive. I kind of took the role after them, I think. I was the guy that was solid, very all round, I think. I could clutch, I could entry frag, but more than anything, I kind of put the team before my individual performance, I think. So that was kind of what helped the team, I think, and it was kind of why maybe I came a little bit in the shadow of other players in our team. But you know, I would say I was one of the most all-round players back then, I would say. I would guess if we use the rating today that we have today, I think it would show off that I was, you know, decently all-round, decently consistent, I think.
Okay. What about this then? So, as I mentioned, the team before Hyper joined had already gotten to like a pretty decent level, obviously much better than people would expect because some of these weren't very well-known players. And then you got Hyper into the lineup, but that's when basically you start to get the big results, go to the really big tournaments. Now, Hyper was already a known player. As I said, he'd been in like the Highland Online team. He'd been in a few different Swedish teams at the time. Right? Who was this guy as a player? Because as I remember, like clearly he's a very big name, as you say, like skilled player, etc. But there was some aspect which you alluded to before, which was like unlike a lot actually of star players back in the day, he was interested in the tactical side, and then at some point he later on was an in-game leader himself, and when he was in SK, for example, he was trying to do that. So what was that aspect? 'Cause it seems like that's actually kind of a unique element to someone who was a big name, because actually it wasn't in the old days considered sexy to be like a tactician or something. You want to just be the guy killing everyone.
Yeah. And he was good at the killing part, obviously. I think, as I kind of mentioned it, he's a quite big personality, and I think that showed off in game too, because he had a lot of opinions of how we should play. So, together with vilden, it became apparent that we could do something more than we had done before, and I think it was very just as all players, but he was involved in creating those tactics for sure, and he kind of used experience from Kaya and Highland Online and kind of implemented that together with us. I think we kind of put him in situations because he was the perfect entry fragger, right? He was the best aimer in our team, so we kind of put him in the most aggressive roles on almost all the maps, and let him do his thing, but still always be close to the second player, right? That was kind of the key element, I think, of our success, right? Because we understood that concept way earlier than most people. I would say, we understood that concept before everyone, even, I think.
Like to trade fag the first guy.
To trade frags, exactly. And always to base tactics from a team level, I think, rather than an individual level. I mean, this wouldn't work on all players, I don't think. If you put Spawn in a position that he needs to, follow a pretty static tactic, sure. I don't think that wouldn't make him the best player in the world, right? But it kind of worked for our squad because everyone was willing to adapt. Everyone was willing to lose out on their individual performance for the team's sake, I think.
Sure.
So he was on line with that. He was on par with that. So I think he was just a very skilled player in all terms of Counter-Strike, both tactically and individually. And he could play the arm. He could play, all rifles. He was good with pistols. He was the whole package, I think.
So if you guys all to some degree could have input into these elements, and vilden was like the mastermind, was vilden the one who called all the strats in the game? Would Hyper call sometimes? Was there a mix in that sense?
I would definitely say that vilden was the one making the most calls for sure. Hyper was kind of the second in-game leader, I think. Okay. So they were responsible for that part the most. Me and GudeN were involved as well. I think to become the best team in the world, you need to have change ideas even during a match, I think, because you don't have all the information yourself. So, but they were the two that kind of controlled that area the most, I think.
Because here's the thing that's a bit funny about these guys, right? It's I knew Hyper a little bit a long, long time ago at this era, and he was someone where, as I mentioned, if you even just see him as a person, it's so clear that he's going to be the star player person because he's a very confident person, he thinks that he can win. But what's interesting is not a lot of people back then, because he was actually, more of a private person, knew vilden actually when he was a pro player, because he wasn't the guy doing all the interviews, And from getting to know him, but actually years later, when he'd been retired for many years, he's a very unusual character. So I want to ask you about him, because here's the thing. First of all, considering he's a quiet person, he's got very strong opinions. He's really stubborn. I remember I did an interview with him, right? This is after he'd been retired for years. And he actually got really offended that in the interview, when I asked the questions, I set up I characterized the time period, and your team was, falling off at this point, or they had success, and cause at one point when him or the team had actually done badly, I'd said at that point, people didn't think you were very good. He got super offended. And he was like, no, you don't know what you're talking. We were really good back then. That was just a bad tournament or something. He seems like a guy who's very passionate, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's the player I still hang around with today and have done for quite many years now. So I know him well. I think he's one of the not only for esport. He's one of the smartest guys I know. He's very intelligent. He's very well educated in the areas he wants to be talking about, if you could say it like that. He's like very he almost always says what he thinks. He's not afraid of backing it up. He knows what he's talking about. He is open to listen to you, but you need to convince him if he thinks differently. He wouldn't just accept your opinion, you know? He would need you to explain why it should replace his own opinion, I think. So I can definitely see that he reacted if he thinks you said something that isn't correct. So he's a very strong character, I would say, and he's probably, I think he says that himself, that he's almost a quite misunderstood person. I think people see him as pretty arrogant sometimes.
Yes.
Although,
I mean, the logic is right. Like I have this myself in some ways in my personality. It's like if someone makes a really great point and I actually think they're right, I'll totally change to their point immediately and go like, right, you've made a great point and that's correct. Yep. But the problem is if they make their point and it's like it doesn't quite make sense to me, it's like I'm a bit stubborn. Like I'll just stick with what my point is because, again, I'm going on some kind of like a logical bent, you know. So, yeah, the reason why I ask this though is because was there like, considering it's a Swedish team, right? Famously, Swedish teams usually had very good chemistry. There wasn't a lot of arguing, you know. People knew that, like, who's in charge, what their role is. Was there a lot of arguing over, like, what we should do and tactics and things and how we play a certain team?
Yeah, and I think that's why GudeN was such a good element to our team, because he wasn't afraid to question vilden. I'm a kind of more of a passive guy, or at least I was then. I'm maybe not now as much, but still towards that end of the spectrum. GudeN is kind of the opposite. He's not afraid of conflict, so he questioned vilden a lot, and that kind of made vilden have to, you know, prove his point a little bit more and even try a little bit harder. And I think that kind of developed the tactics parts even more, you know. So. Hyper is not that, you know, he's not afraid to express his thoughts as well. So I think, yeah, definitely vilden was the voice that, you know, were there the most, but definitely counter voices as well, for sure.
Okay. How good was vilden as an AWPer then? Because obviously this team, like we say, came up from like tactics and from being a great team together. So individually, how good was he?
Yeah, I think he was one of the best for sure. I think many see Kugo as one of the best back then, right? I think that was the one guy that I think vilden looked up to. Okay. So I don't know if he will say it himself, but I think maybe he thought maybe Kugo was better than him. I don't know. Or he probably placed himself as first or second at least. And I would say the same.
Okay. So one of the big tournaments that you guys attended was when you went to the CPL Europe event in Copenhagen. And this was when the SK Gaming team was basically like easily the number one team. They were like winning every tournament, and they usually didn't even drop a map when they did it. You know, they were like, this is when they had Element and Spawn, like you say. They had one of the craziest lineups ever. And,
sure.
You know, and at the time, that's why the whole storyline wasn't really like, is anyone going to beat SK? Because at the time, it looked like nobody could. It was more like, do they actually even have any challenge? You know, is there any rivals? Is there anyone who could like make this interesting? And actually, obviously, people at the time expected, right, it's going to be Veslin's team, it's going to be the Adrenaline team. They should be able to do it because, you know, they have the great sponsorship and Veslin's got big names, he's got Executor, etc. Or maybe it'll be some North American team, it'll be Team 3D or whoever it was at the time, you know. But actually, your team was one of the ones that came along, and this is obviously the tournament where you made it to the final, you played against SK a few times. Was it a big deal to actually go to an international tournament? Because, it's one thing to be just in Sweden and then challenge another Swedish team. These things happen, qualifiers, as you're saying, ESWC, World Cyber Games. But to go to an international tournament, it's like a different level of pressure, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that was kind of the biggest test for us. I think we've been longing for that test too. And I remember prior to the tournament, there was pretty tense. Pretty tense situation between us and SK. We had some. I don't know if anyone knows about this, but there was some tenseness between SK and eyeballers back then because, we were pretty confident when we scrimmed and we made some comments and I know they weren't the happiest with us.
Some trash talk.
Some trash talk basically. I remember a situation where me and Paddy went one-on-one on D2. He planted a bomb in B, and I went there and I took him out. And then the other round, again, it was exactly the same scenario. So, and this time I defused the bomb before Paddy could come there, and then I killed him afterward. And then I told him, at least you were closer this time or something like that.
Okay.
And that became a big thing, a really big thing. They were very dramatic about that, and they looked forward to seeing us on LAN and stuff like that. So it's a bit tense, So we wanted to really perform on that event, and we kind of felt, with the backup of our scrims, the weeks before, that we could challenge them. And I think we were pretty close too, right? We were like 13-11 or something like that in the final.
The final map was 13-10, so it's pretty close.
Yeah, pretty close. But still, we kind of felt like they always just put in, a higher gear when they needed to, right? So we kind of felt like even though we were closer, we were still behind. So I think a second place there was, we thought that was okay, although, we wanted that title. I think just going there as a young person, I was probably 16 back then or something like that. So that was kind of good as well, just getting that experience before going to the biggest events, I guess. But this was close to the biggest events as well. So yeah, it was the environment I remember was pretty weird one too. It was in Denmark, right? So it was like out on the shore or something like that. I was like a big storage unit. So it was like pretty weird, big event. We would think it was kind of more neatly organized than it was, I think. But was a good experience.
Because actually, what the storyline for the SK team, for people who don't know, is like when people say like the SK team in 2003 so dominant, like they don't actually mean the whole year because they didn't get Element until like the summer actually at that point in time. And in fact, they didn't win their first tournament because it was ESWC when they had him. But it was after that every event they won the CPL Summer and they won the Swedish Esport League and then they won this tournament, Copenhagen, and they went to the next CPL. And so during that stretch of time, as I referenced before, they actually didn't even lose a map once this streak began, But when they finally lost a map was when there was the CyberX Games qualifier, and you guys beat them on Dust 2. They still won the qualifier itself, but even to beat them in a map at the time, like I'm saying, this wasn't happening. No one was beating them. So I have two questions on this. One, what was the significance of actually being able to beat them on a map? Like, was it a big moment? And secondly, why do you think they were so seemingly unbeatable at the time?
I remember that tournament quite clearly, and it was definitely a big moment for us. I think it's kind of like the English mile thing when when like
the first person to run a 4-minute mile.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And then like a year after, they were like 35 or something. I don't remember.
Yes, everyone was doing it afterwards.
Yeah. So that was kind of for us. That was it. We knew we could beat them. We lost the final again because they kind of just geared up, I guess, and just kind of they needed to win, and then they just did that. So we were closing in, and we know that we had the ability to do it, so that was important. What was the other question, by the way?
Why were they so hard to beat?
I mean, I think most of it comes from just having been that top team for so long. I mean, you have like a respect towards them that you shouldn't have. And also, I mean, big thing is that they had the best players, right?
Yes.
I mean, they still had that. So in order to beat them, they needed to have like a bad day, or we needed to develop a skill set that they didn't have. And developing a skill, a play that kind of evolves around beating them on a team level rather than an individual level, that takes time to develop, I think. So I think that's why it took time, actually. Just, getting that to work was a lot of work, I think, and finally it paid off.
Okay, one thing that is actually positive about having one team that wins every tournament, and that if you're going to go deep, you're going to meet this team sometime, is that in theory, people can actually focus on that team and try and figure out what are they doing and stuff. Were guys like vilden and Hyper, were they actually like studying SK? Were they obsessed with it? It sounds like when I talked to vilden, like he was like super obsessed with the idea we have to beat this team. Yeah,
of course. They were definitely the most observed team from our side, for sure. We kind of looked at counter strats. We kind of looked at openings, looked at the spots they were at, where we controlled the flashes, the smokes, everything like that, for sure. And I think that developed even more prior to CPL 04. That was, as we won that was that was obviously our best time, where we had like the most perfect gameplay in our history, for sure. But yeah, that started to show in 03 as well. And yeah, they were the most absurd. I don't think they observed us at all.
No.
They, if you're at the top, you don't do that, But
yeah, this is something I want to ask, actually, because as I alluded to before, what I said actually might shock some people, because people naively think that a lot, like, for example, when they see teams nowadays playing, they all have a coach and an analyst, and they watch the matches, and, the in-game leader tells them what they're going to do and scouts the opponent. People might think, there was professionalism back here, and there was big prize money, but a lot of that stuff actually... First of all, not even every team now does it. It's still developed even in CSGO. And if you go back in time, it's more like certain teams and certain leaders have that philosophy and some others don't. Just like now, there's still some teams that play a very loose style. Yeah. Back then, that was actually... I knew people like Heaton and Potty. And as I say, one of the things they didn't tend to do, aside from when they had like Element and Execute, they didn't typically tend to recruit like the tactical in-game leader and try and do like that, a lot of that. Because the thing is, they were so good individually. They had the philosophy of like, right, let's just find a way to sort of like exist in the server together. Like, I'm going to do my thing here. You're going to do your part over here, and if we all kill everyone, then we win the round. And they were right. If you have the best players, you can win the tournament. But they weren't doing super in-depth tactics, right? I mean, it probably was quite interesting to try and break down.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think they, as we've touched before, they relied on raw skill together with great comms. I think they were probably the best team, or one of the best team at comms, for sure.
Sure.
And Fisker helped them out there. He was the best. I've heard this from vilden as well. He was the best at comms in the world. He hasn't played with a player that is better than in comms than Fisker was. Okay. And I think Heaton is pretty good at it too. So that was definitely raw skill combined with comms. Why they could keep on winning all the time. But yeah, I mean, kind of sidetracked there, but the SK team, in terms of, I mean, I actually don't know them too well, so I don't know exactly what they did in terms of tactics, but my pre-assumption is that they did like the simple static things. They did the old things that worked before, and they kept on doing that until they lost, I think. And since they'd never lost, I mean, why wouldn't they, I guess?
Makes sense.
I kind of got the feeling in 04 that they kind of needed a loss almost, because it became too simple for them almost. It's like they needed to wake up, I think, to start doing something else, because the game developed. They could live on their raw skills still, but teams came closer and closer. And NOA, for example, is also a team that, challenged them. And I think that was, executors and elements, that they were the key parts there. and they also had like the strategic mindset in a way. Now they were kind of a combination of our team and SK, I think. Raw skills combined with a little bit more tactical thinking than SK. So okay. That's what I think, why I think they were becoming good eventually as well. So I think, the key part was that we had identified what we needed to do in terms of beating them. And that was definitely team play and tactical advantage for sure.
I actually have a question along those lines that maybe you can give me some insight on, which is when you bring up this topic of like communication and tie it to that term, which is such an important term, team play, but it's such a vague term. No one knows what it means. Like everyone sort of vaguely knows what it means, but in each team, I'm sure it'd be slightly different how they do it, Yep. One of the things that's very unique I've noticed about Swedish communication style is in some teams, so probably the most famous example is like North American teams, their style of communication is very chaotic. It's like each person is just individually almost saying everything he sees. Like two people here, like one there, like I'm shooting him, like, and so it's very chaotic, right? There's a lot of like, I call it like signal noise, there's a lot of stuff that the player in the moment might think I've got to tell them everything. But like, some of that stuff probably isn't that important to his teammate. And sometimes it's better to just only say the important thing, And I noticed whenever I saw the Swedish teams play, so someone who's seen that style would think, right, well, the Swedish teams must do the same thing, but they're just better at it. It's like, no, actually, I noticed they said less, but somehow whatever they said was like all that the other his teammate needed to know. It sounds like that's actually, there's like a skill to that, right?
For sure. This is one of the most underestimated skills, I would say. I don't know exactly how it is in CS today because I followed it for a year, like 2017, but before that I didn't. So, and then I started with PUBG. So that kind of, then I lost touch with the Counter-Strike scene again. But yeah, I mean, the key element I think in communication is not to say what, it's to say how. Basically, everyone can say what we should do, but not everyone can say how we should do it and how we should use the other players to make you better and them better. Me going towards one direction and doing a thing must be combined with what others can do for me and vice versa. And I think that's a lot of teams today don't really understand that concept. I think that too many players focus on the information they have in front of them and not too much what it could mean if we, made this play as a team. I think just developing a mindset of always being able to kind of help each other if we have if we are in a position to do so, that would help a lot of teams right now. It's like, or especially back then, I think, because as you say, North American teams, they were like talking very fast. So they got a lot of information in there, but as you say, most of the information is not very useful. I don't need to tell that there's a player on B, because everyone knows there's a player on B, right? I mean, even if I shoot him, doesn't mean I should tell them exactly what he's doing right now. It should only be told when we're actually doing something towards him, when we're, acting towards going towards BB or something like that, if that's where it is. I think so. The how part is what's important in communication. And I think not too many players have developed that. And I think it requires, as you say, it needs to be a leader that understands this concept, and he needs to kind of give birth to that concept for the other 4 players. I think both Hyper and vilden, all the team, we shouldn't just mention them, but all the team understood that quite early. And some were better at it, and some were decent at it. But altogether we were a 5-man team that did that well, for sure.
Right. One thing that's kind of interesting is, as I said, I asked, if you'd followed the esports side when you were coming up yourself as a player before you got to the top. Because what's interesting is this is another example for people who don't know the industry of esports and they just watch the tournaments. So what happens is you get a team who gets good domestically. They're good in Sweden. And then in this case, you go to an international tournament. It's still just in Denmark, It's not somewhere like super exotic. You just go over to Denmark, you play there. Still though, it's an international, you get to play more teams from outside the region. But even though, as we say, in the final here, you're close to SK, you're doing really well. So on paper, people want to be like, right, this team's, they're at the level SK's at. But to then go to a CPL in Dallas, sure, those events weren't as glamorous as people would think of an event now, and actually there were some aspects to it where it was like, the venue wasn't that insane or anything. But it's a new experience, you've got to go to another country, another continent in this case. Again, different teams you might have never faced from North America, etc. What was this like for someone who actually knew about this before? Like you'd seen CPLs, etc. Was it a big deal to go to it?
Yeah, for sure, it was a big deal. I mean, especially when you come from Sweden in Counter-Strike, you had pretty high hopes. Although this being the first international event, right? Because you scrimmed versus some of the best teams in the world, and or the best team in the world for sure. So you kind of had high expectations, although not being experienced. So I think it was kind of a time where we felt a little bit too much pressure, I think, because we kind of expected to be top 3 at the first CPL. That was Winter 04, right? Or
03.
03, okay. Yes. So of course, Winter 03. And I think we ended up 6th or something like that. And
so this was a shock?
Yeah, it was a shock because it was apparent that everyone except Hyper underperformed individually. And if you underperform individually, it's kind of hard to, still win, right, as a team.
Sure.
Even though we focused on team play. I mean, that was still in the making. I mean, it was pretty early still, but so the team playing part was still in the making, and they couldn't really make up for poor performances individually yet, at least. So I think that was what happened in CPL Winter 03, that we underperformed individually, and that's why we didn't end up at the top 3. But still, the experience was great. I think that was laid kind of that made us perform later on in the next CPL.
Okay. Because actually, it's a team you referred to earlier. You were also one of the teams where you're absolutely right. The expectations were right. If this is the second best Swedish team, well, we know SK is the best. That should be like, worst case, top 3, top 4. They should obviously be playing teams like SK again. Let's do the rematch. And one of the reasons you didn't get to was your team was one of the victims of the NOA team. Now, this was the NOA team before they had Element Executed, when they still had BSL, but they had the rest of the core, Jaguar, Method, etc. Now, what people might not know, because now that name is a very famous name and people know they did great at this CPL. They later on went on to win a different CPL we'll talk about later. What people don't know is that team was a shock to everyone. Like, I think at the time, famously, they had the 32nd seed or something ridiculous in the tournament, and they hadn't done anything before this. It was like this weird mixed team of some North American players and some European, no one had ever tried anything like this before. And this was the tournament where they did kind of like a miracle run. They just were playing all, because they had a bad seed, they had to play a lot of known teams. Yeah. They beat a lot of them, and some of them they beat very heavily. So was this a team where, when you're going through the tournament and you're looking at the bracket and you're like, right, in the next 2 rounds we might play this squad, or know who we're going to meet in the semi-finals, or what? Were you thinking like this is a team we should beat?
I think we didn't have too much respect for any teams that were based in America, I don't think.
Okay.
Not even 3D. I don't know if where they
yes.
at. Yeah. I mean, we know they were good, but we still, kind of, we were from Sweden, and we know SK is the best in the world. So, yeah, for sure. I think we at least thought we were as good as any other team but SK, I think. I don't remember exactly how it played out. Did we play versus NOA in 03?
Yes, you played them on Cobblestone, apparently.
Okay. And I don't know if that was early on or if it was later in the...
That was in the upper bracket.
In
the
the
team
upper
that
bracket.
eliminated you in the bottom was the Mouse Sports team, which actually was one of their first... Which obviously the team you'd played at CPL Copenhagen as well, which was actually a very good lineup, because that was when they made like the German super team, you know, with all the Neo and all those guys, yeah.
Yeah, was Johnny R in there? Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was a pretty famous guy. He was one of the best oppers as well, for sure. But yeah, so yeah, I think we expected to win for sure versus those teams. I don't know exactly if we had much respect for any. I mean, respect is maybe the wrong word, but believe that we would lose versus any of the other teams but SK. I don't think.
So okay, when you go back the next year, was one thing that did happen, which is kind of an unusual story, is if this was like a movie, okay, and you were making the storyline, you'd want to actually keep the identical lineup, because the most satisfying storyline would be like, you know, the same lineup like rose up together, like lost to in this case it'd be like the villain would be SK, I guess, you know, they'd be like the evil guys who have all the
for sure.
all the most famous players and stuff, you know, the arrogant guys, and then you'd want in the story to just make the exact same team beat them. But actually what made it even more incredible that you guys won the next big CPL was that you had to do these weird roster moves where, as we referenced before, there was this period of time where you had to make... What was the reasoning behind why you had to make the roster move initially? Someone just couldn't attend, or someone left the team, and then you had to get IsKall into the team, who at the time hadn't been in a big international team, you know, he wasn't a known player, and he was just coming in as a stand-in. So very unlikely circumstances, people would think, to then go on and win the big championship. So can you explain some of that to me?
Yeah, so I believe it was that CRW had to do a medical surgery prior to the event, and he couldn't recover before we had to go. So that was that, and that I think I think we expected him to actually get back in time. Right. That's why IsKall was brought in so late. So I think we started playing with IsKall maybe 3 weeks prior to the event. 2 of those weeks, or 10 days at least, was at the boot camp. But you know, still very, very too close into the actual event. But so that was the story behind it. I think IsKall was first of all, there weren't that many players to choose from. IsKall made the most sense because he's like he's a wonderful guy. Yeah, kind of like a how would you say it? Kind of like a very mature guy. Okay. Yeah, very stable guy, very solid, very, you know, kind of like you felt kind of comfortable being around him. So he gave the team a lot of energy just being there. Individually, he was definitely fitting our requirements for an eyeballers player back then, and that was focusing on the team, right? He wasn't an individual player. He was very much able to understand the concept very early, and kind of took all these support roles all over the maps, you know. Then he got to shine in the final too, so that was nice. But yeah, so that was the reason why we choose him, and not maybe a more individually skilled player.
Okay. So one of the things about this tournament is, as I say, not only were you coming in with a stand-in who you hadn't played in a big LAN tournament with, and not only did you win this tournament, which is obviously one of the big tournaments in the world. These were like, we used to consider them sort of like world championships back then. You know, it was the biggest event you could win, but your team also was just winning in ridiculous fashion. Like, if you go back and you look at the results, no one in the whole tournament even gets 10 rounds in a map. Like, most wins are like 13-5, 13-6. Yeah. Back when we had 13 rounds was the winning back. It was MR12, not MR15 yet. Yeah. So this, if the other CPL was the one where it was like, ended up being disappointing, you know, things didn't go the way you want. This sounds like what everyone's dream scenario is like, where it's just everything's perfect and you just can't lose. What was it like?
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if you remember the story before traveling there, that we lost a sponsor. Right. That was just like a week before, something like that. Our manager told us that the sponsor had withdrawn.
And you guys paid yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we couldn't pay. We didn't have money for the hotel or the other flights, and everyone took out of their own pockets because everyone was confident that we could win. So, and I think vilden kind of vilden actually paid for most of it, actually.
That's still a big investment, though, because for people who don't know, true, if you win the event, yeah, great, that's great prize money. But as soon as you start to get down in the rankings, if you even think about the one before where you came sixth.
Yeah.
If you come sixth, that isn't going to cover all those costs.
Exactly. So I think he paid out a substantial amount, at least when you were that young too. So I think it was up against 10,000 or something like that.
Okay.
Dollars. So with the kind of the deal was that if we weren't, getting the prize money to cover it, we would play local lawns in Sweden to make up for it. That was kind of the arrangement. So he didn't really. I mean, it's still a risk, but still, we wanted to go to that event. We felt very good. The scrims had gone. We almost didn't lose a map. We were very, very tactically sound back then. We had some new stuff prior to, if you compare to the prior events we did. Although just having 2-3 weeks with IsKall, we felt that he were a good part of the team quite quickly. So I think I don't know. That really, I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but I think most good teams were at that event, right?
Yeah, it was really stacked.
Pretty stacked, yeah. So, and I remember what you say, that we won 13-9 versus SK in the upper bracket. That was the closest one, yeah. And everyone else was 13-5 or 13-6. So, I mean, and we felt that. I mean, we had such a flow. It was amazing, the whole tournament. Everything worked, everyone stepped up. No one was playing, bad. It was an amazing flow, and I think we just having the mindset that you're willing to kind of risk money for going there because you have such confidence that you will probably win. That kind of helped us, I think. Just that those prior misarrangements kind of helped us in boosting our confidence even more, I think.
So, okay, as you referenced earlier, the team that you played in the final and the upper bracket final was SK Gaming. It was like the rematch people would want to see. These still, Heaton, Potty, Spawn, the really sick players that everyone remembers. Yep. Now, what's interesting about this part is, as we referred to earlier in the story, you played them in the past. You played them in the CPL Copenhagen. You would even be the first team to get the land victory off them at the CXG qualifier. But, and in practice, as you say, you're practicing against them, you're doing very well. But that's the key aspect. Like, that sounds like you're really, really close. It's like there's just one last bit to go. But there's a lot of people with the storyline of like, oh, we were so, we could beat them in a scrim or something. A lot of people have that story. Not that many people actually then did it. And in fact, when you were saying earlier about the fact that, like, because they were so experienced and they were used to winning, they thought they were supposed to win. That actually can be a strength in the game because people then feel like they know how to close a game out. They know how to win in a close match. And in fact, even at this tournament, I remember it happened because in the lower bracket final, when you were waiting to see who you would play, they played the American team rival. And I remember this was a game that was like an overtime game.
Yeah,
There's a round in this game I vividly remember where like they probably should have lost this game and it probably actually should have been the rival team playing you. But Potty won like some like 1v3 with like 10 health or something, And I remember at the time, right, some of the American players were telling me like, oh, we were so close, you just got so lucky. Yeah. And I was like, how many people have that story? Like, that's why this team didn't lose, because even if you did a great game against them, they were the professionals. They knew how to close the game. They knew how to be winning the end of a game. So it must be a big deal to then actually beat the team and take the title from them.
Yeah, and I remember that that's as a kind of tells a story in itself that we were happy that SK actually won that game, that versus rival, that they were so close of losing and that they still won. That kind of we wanted to challenge them. We felt that we could. So I remember that quite vividly as well. And I agree with you. I mean, every time SK was in a tight situation, they kind of just stepped up and made it work, even though they shouldn't, like versus rival in that game. So I guess, but we had experienced that before, we had been close, as you say, we had been close before, still lost. We, stacked up those experiences, kind of used them, together with winning in the upper bracket. We had won 2 times in official events. So just using that, on a map where, where they should be the dominant team. I think they were like the good Inferno team, which was the final. They were very confident that they would win both maps. So I talked to them after the event, and they told us that they truly believe they would win two maps, for sure. So I think, it's all the prior experiences and all the willingness behind winning versus them that kind of stacked up in that final for sure. And that was, I mean, just telling that story, it means that we had to lose like 10 times before, right? And most teams losing 10 times before would probably have done something to their team, maybe split up, maybe quit CS, I don't know. But there was a determination in this team to actually take this from them. And I think that was what's paying off in the end, for sure.
So unfortunately, like if anyone's listening to that part of the story, they should be thinking, like let's say someone wasn't from this era, they should be like, oh, awesome, right, so your team wins, dominant fashion, you've got this new player scenario, like what happens next? Sadly, what happens next is a bit depressing actually, because you'd want to see this team play, like you want to see the sequel, you want to see the next CPL, you want to see that. But obviously, I mean, it ties into what you were saying before. Even though Eyeballers was a big name because of coming from Quake and stuff, and it was an organization people knew, it wasn't like SK Gaming that had like, the biggest sponsors in the world and like amazing business stuff. And so unfortunately, as we were saying before, one of the reasons why SK was always number one and was always like, or at least number two and number three, right up there, is if they ever needed players, they just went and got the best players. They just go to the next best player and say, hey, join our team. So unfortunately, it's not like your team had the best situation and then Hyper got this offer to go over and play in SK Gaming. And at the time, that is a lot of players' dream. It's like, right, I want to play with Heaton and Poddy. I want to win all the championships, get really good salary, etc. What happened? Like, what was it like when he came and basically said, like, I'm going to leave the team?
Yeah,
like, were you super against it?
Not really. I don't think I think this was kind of talked about even the tournament before in 03 Winter when we failed as a team. And I know that Hyper, who lived in Stockholm, where all the SK guys were as well, he had some pressure from home that he needed to start making money. The other 4 guys in our team didn't have that pressure from our parents, basically. And I know he mentioned that SK was in touch with him, if I remember correctly, already in 03 Winter. So it was talked about, but he decided that give our organization a chance to actually fix sponsorships so we could actually be paid and to try it out for 04 as well. So when we actually won, we all thought that, okay, now we won. Now we will get the sponsorships we need. We'll continue with the lineup and we'll, win in 04 Winter as well.
Yes.
So it was kind of the timing of him leaving was a little bit weird, I think, because the follow-up from the win, supposedly would be that he would get paid in Eyeballers too.
Yes.
And we got those sponsorships later on too, so he probably would have. But yeah, so he was just eager to start earning money to just get a more comfortable living situation with his family. I think that was the reason. That's how I remember it. I don't know if he remembers it like that, but that's how I remember it. So that I don't think we were too. I think we kind of that was a bummer for sure. I think that lineup could have done, great for a few events more. We got good replacements for sure. So we were we were still the favorite coming in 04 in the winter.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, losing that lineup was, having fought so long together, that was, it was not something we thought it would not happen after winning the tournament.
Because as you just say there, by the time the next CPL comes around, you made another good squad and you got some different players. Yep. But I remember in the meantime, Bevah came back. You tried bringing him back in the line. Now, here's the thing. That obviously didn't last and it wasn't that great a move. What was the thinking behind doing it? Because obviously, 1-for-1, you can't just replace Hyper with Bevah and think you're going to have the same results. So what was the philosophy behind doing that? Did you know that you were going to have future roster moves? What was the situation?
I think we kind of, I agree with you. Bevah wasn't the type of player that Hyper was. He wasn't, a 1-by-1 replacement. I think what our thinking was that Bevah was such a good, such a valuable player back in the days that we wanted to give him a shot when the opening was there. And he had just came back from the military service. And we didn't have any other, didn't have any other option back then, I don't think. So we kind of decided to give him a shot at one of the Swedish events. I think it was Nohak or something like that.
It was Nolalva.
Yeah, okay, Nolalva. Okay, Yep. So that didn't work out. I think we missed. That was an unbalanced team in a way. We needed one of those fraggers that we kind of lost. We lost with Hyper. We needed at least one of them to enable to kind of balance out the team. I would have had to step up in that role if that were supposed to work, I think, because Bevah was more like playing like me, I think. And I was too established as a support player, I think, or like the third player in the hierarchy or something like that I couldn't just make that move. And then it became like vilden, who was the only aggressive player.
Okay.
So it was an unbalanced team. That's why it didn't work. So just, using that experience made us make 2 new changes, and that was bringing in Walle and Bullen, which kind of Bullen is kind of like a Bevah type of player. Still very, very skilled, still gets a lot of frags, but he's like still the team type of player, I would say. In the clutch player, he could do a lot of 1v versus X situations, and Walle was the Hyper player for sure. Walle, I've never seen anyone be as good as Walle was back then. I've never in my life seen, maybe Cold Sierra when he was at his best.
Okay.
I haven't followed the scene enough to say that, but that's what the experience I have. So Walle was kind of lifting up the team on his own for sure.
Yeah, because as you say, you got these 2 guys who at the time they'd risen up themselves in the Spixel team, which had been very good. But as you say, yes, Bullen obviously was like talented. He was like more of like a, as you say, a clutch player, like all-round player. But the thing about Walle was he was someone where, because him and his brother had made those, I think it was actually his brother who made those frag movies where it was just like, at the time, probably the most ridiculous movies anyone had ever made, because they literally used all like the scrim clips, So as a result, like, they weren't like official matches, but they just basically played a million gathers and pickups.
Yeah.
And then they just never used the scope on the ARP and just went for the no scope. And so as a result, the movies look amazing. But when you watch them, you're like, I don't think any human can ever do this in a real match. It's like, it's too insane. And it's like you hit 4 long range no scopes. So the expectation though, when you see someone like that is you want to know, can they do any of that stuff in the actual game? So when you first got these guys into your team, this is why, as you say, you came into the tournament, and most people don't know this, but the hype before the tournament was that this new Eyeballers team was the favourite, because first of all, the SK team with Hyper didn't end up going. They had like a contract dispute with their team, and then the NOA team, which ends up winning, actually had their own problems, they'd had to make roster moves, they'd been a bit of a slump. And I remember at the time, the other European teams basically said that this Eyeballers team just was winning like every scrim.
Yeah, except versus SK.
Okay.
SK
were going to the tournament.
No, I know. SK was just as dominant as we were on the scrim level. I remember that, so we were kind of that was the top contender for sure prior to the events, and then it didn't go, so that kind of made it easier for us.
Okay.
But they were really good. I think the Hyper effect had actually brought them something in terms of the strategical part of it. So we went in there with high hopes for sure. We like Walle was getting like 15, 20 frags on each side every scrim. It was taking out like it was insane. I've never seen anything like that. It was crazy.
Did you have to adapt the team at all to that? Like,
yeah.
Did you play a bit more individualistic?
Yeah, we kind of let him go a little bit like SK let Spawn go, because we think that fitted his personality, his playing style more. He was not at that time, at least. I think maybe he become later in SK a team player as Hyper was. He was so relied so much on his his skill and his ability to take out players so much that he wanted to go on his own routes basically. So we kind of let him do that. It still was a little bit within the frames of the eyeballers methods, but still a little bit more of a free roll than Hyper got, I think. Bullen was also very tactically sound, so he kind of complimented us in that way. He was sort of a nice GudeN type of character. I mean, everyone loved Bullen. Rest in peace. He was wonderful. So he kind of combined. Yeah, we got a good type of communication in game and off game was pretty sound, I think, with GudeN, vilden, bullen, me, and then Walle kind of, a little bit as the fifth player, having to do his own, and the other four kind of talked more on the tactic level, I think.
Right. One of the things about this tournament that's unusual is, like, it looked like the other tournament where, again, all the map scores are looking really great for your team. But when you met the NOA team, which ended up being the one that obviously challenged you in the final and was one of the other big names at the tournament, the first meeting was basically, it was like everyone got teased and we never got a real match. Because if you remember, the game was like it was a nuke game, and they had the flash bug thing where they got like most of the half taken from, because the rule back then, for anyone who doesn't know, is because the tournament organizers themselves didn't have any access to the game. Valve didn't really know or care about esports back then. So this one bug existed on the map Nuke for a long time, where unfortunately, if a flashbang went under that box that's right at the ramp room, which obviously is exactly the area you throw flashes to blind people in the ramp room, it had a bug where it actually blinded the whole map. And so unfortunately, since you couldn't stop people doing this, people just made really harsh punishments, and they said if you do it, you just lose every round on that half. And unfortunately, NOA did it really early, and basically it just like ended the game before it began, sort of, like it wasn't a proper game. So when something like that happens, even if you win it, it's kind of like you were robbed of a match, right?
Yeah, I remember that quite clearly. And the thing was that they didn't do it on purpose, right? But they still managed to do it quite many times. It wasn't just the one time. Okay. I think they did it almost like 4 or 5 times. So we were kind of crushed on that side of the map. And we didn't really get, I mean, we felt like they were kind of just a better team on that map for sure. And I don't know how much that impacted the actual flash bug. But I think, looking backwards now when we lost the final, that they were playing really well in that event. They were, very well synced, good individual skill, and I think maybe my teammates will not agree with, but I think the best team for sure won that event in the end. Okay. But yeah, I agree with you. We didn't really know where we stood after that game because we got it handed to us. But on the other hand, I think it was probably the right decision actually in terms of how many times they used the flashback that they actually lost that game.
Fair enough.
If it was only one time, I would say, I mean, that it wouldn't matter really, but since they used it so many times, I think it was like a decent way of solving it.
Okay, so as you say, I'm going to go ahead and guess some of your teammates probably aren't as fair-minded as you are. Like, from my experience, most Counter-Strike players, if they ever lose a game close, like in their mind, definitely should have won, it was unlucky, and that guy got, it's bullshit that guy won. Well, the problem is, in the final, there's 2 factors. One, people are fully aware of, which is any team that came in from the upper bracket final always won the CPL because the other team had to beat you twice, and that's the problem. Listen, there was plenty of finals where someone did win the first map or whatever, but the problem is because you have to beat the team 2 times in a row, the better team usually is going to win, and usually that means it's the team from the upper bracket final. Well, the problem is the first map you played in the final was the one that was 16-14. This is when we were using match rounds 15, and so the first one really is the one where it's like that could have been the championship, right?
Yep, for sure. And they won some ridiculous 1 versus 3. I remember more than one.
We had a couple of them, yeah.
Yeah, it was really So I don't know if we choked or something. We definitely could measure up against them for sure. I mean that was shown in the final, but it was the first map that was tight. The other one was like 16-12 or something like that.
The other one was a bigger win.
16-10 maybe. Yeah. So, and that's what I was kind of referring to earlier, that they just felt like they were a more stable team. I don't know. They kind of just clutching those 1 versus 3 kind of tells a story. I think that they were, wanted it more. I don't know, had, a bigger belief in they had a belief from the nuke map as well, I think, because they kind of did well, right? They crushed us pretty hard, I think, on nuke until that flashback came along. So they had some confidence from that as well. They had done good in the prior matches to the finals. I don't remember exactly how the results, but they kind of felt like they had definitely a peak in that event.
Right. One of the interesting details is, so Valle is obviously a player who played for many years after this, was in SK Gaming, was in NIP between then, he's in a number of top teams. And actually, he is someone who has the unfortunate legacy of, he was in a lot of major finals. Like he was in CPLs, ESWCs, WCGs, and unfortunately, he actually never won one. Like he was always on the team that got denied or heartbroken, and some of them were very close like this as well. What was he like as a teammate? Like, did he take losses hard? Was he more chilled out? What was he like as a personality in that sense?
Yeah, back when I played with him, he was a pretty relaxed guy. I mean, he definitely cared about Counter-Strike, but he was probably the one that cared the how do you say it? The other players were more into the tactic part of the game, but he was kind of what I was talking about earlier. He was so confident in his ability to kill people that he mostly wanted to have fun, I think, and having fun for him was to kill. Basically, he wanted to be that player that got the most kills, I think. Since he was so good at it, we accepted that for sure. But I think it was a little bit hard. I don't think this is anything of. This is not like a general characterization of how he is. But back then, I think it was a little bit harder to work with than the other players. I think he was a little bit too. His mindset was a little bit towards the individual part, I think. So on this side, he was a relaxed guy. He wanted to take it chill, He didn't do he didn't do more than what he needed, I don't think. He was a chill dude for sure. We all came along good, but on the CS part of it, he was maybe a little bit too individually leaned a little bit too much towards that part of the game, I think.
Okay. Because after this, you had actually a tournament early next year back in Sweden, which is the OptiHack tournament, where you took the same lineup, and this was actually a really bad placing, because if this was the one where there was that team called IsKall, which was a mixed team of known players, but not who weren't in a big team at the time, and your team lost to them as one of the results, and then basically this lineup broke up. I think that's when Valle went off to some other team, maybe NIP, and the team gradually broke apart, and you made a different lineup after this.
Yeah.
Was it since the storyline of your team had been that you weren't the squad that made roster moves, and in fact it wasn't until someone stole your player that you went and got some other players?
Yep.
Was this a a strange period of time? Because actually, like, I know this is kind of like how other teams operated. You know, you have good tournaments, you lose a player, right? You get the next best player you can, you try and reshape it, but that wasn't really who your team had been, right?
No, for sure not. I think that's why we were one of the few mature teams in Counter-Strike in that way, that we understood the concept of being consistent and not changing out a player, because changing out a player is like 20% of your team, right? It's not like changing out a player in hockey or football or whatever, anything like that. It has quite a lot of impact just changing out one player. And sometimes it needs to be done, for sure. It could be underlying issues like motivation and stuff like that. And sometimes it's player-based motivations, I think. As long as everyone was motivated, we didn't just start doubting a player just because he had one bad event, right? I mean, his abilities had been shown over years of time. So a player just didn't go bad just for like a bad month or anything like that. So we understood that concept well. And just by being ripped apart, I think that was the name of the game. And when Hyper did it, I got to feel that when one does it, that kind of makes it more okay for the second one to do it. So that's why I think vilden wanted to go in the end. And just getting a new challenge. I mean, I understand that part. So yeah, making a roster change wasn't something we chose to do. It was kind of forced upon us. So that was a decision. Back then, it was a decision to just, should we keep it together? Should we try and make a new lineup for the eyeballers? Or should we just kind of all go our own way? That was the time when I decided, together with vilden, that we will bring a new team together. He and I were, mostly him actually, SK offered him one spot together with Valle. I don't know the other 3 players back then.
I think it was probably because if you remember, when vilden went to NIP and they made that like super team, they actually like failed, and then a bunch of them, including vilden, went back to SK. Basically everyone except Heaton and Poddy. So I assume it was the others of that team, you know. Yeah,
and he didn't want to do that because he was good friends with the Eyeballers organization. We were promised salary, an even bigger salary for the coming year. And he wanted to stay, I don't know, he his word kind of made his promise towards the leaders of Eyeballers meant too much for him to actually make the move. Okay. That's when SK asked if we wanted to bring me with him, and he still wanted us to stay with Eyeballers. So that's what we decided. And that's when the DSN and cArn, and I think it was SAD, right?
Yes.
Who came in at the end. That was a good lineup too, but it kind of missed. It kind of lacked something, I think. But
okay,
yeah.
So yeah.
No. You're gone.
So one of the things about this is, obviously, like you say, this lineup didn't accomplish the things you might have hoped for, but some of you came from the past lineups that had, and obviously in the future, DSN and cArn accomplished a lot, especially with, obviously the Fnatic team was the one that they really proved themselves with. But who were these guys at the time? Because I remember, obviously, you've lost vilden. It was the tactical guy you had in the team. cArn was the in-game leader of the Fnatic teams later. What was he like as an in-game leader at this time? What was DSN like?
I'm trying to remember who actually played in-game leader in that lineup. Because I think it could have been actually vilden who did that at the start, at least. Because DSN and cArn, I don't remember exactly which team they played for when we brought them in. I think maybe it was the Gamers.nu.
They were on that before, but then they'd been in the Big Rip team at the previous CPL.
Okay. So So we knew them pretty well. We had met them several times, so we knew their personalities a lot, and they were kind of motivated to actually bring home a trophy, which they had always failed with before.
Yes.
But they had a good mindset for the game. I think they were kind of schooled in the same way as we, just on a lower level, I think, in terms of what needed to be done to actually achieve something. So that's what we actually could bring them, I think, and then they could just kind of jump aboard and further develop the skill they had already, started with. So I think the only, and I don't like to, I think the mistake we did there was that we brought in the fifth guy too early. I think we would have been a better fit looking for another fifth player. And nothing against Sad at all, but we kind of relied upon GudeN and cArn making that decision. I think we, as the more experienced players, should have kind of, forced that decision on us instead of making these decisions through the new players. So I think that was a core part of why we didn't find any success. I think we should have kind of looked a little bit further for the fifth guy, and just kind of maybe found a talent instead, maybe a fragger, because that's what I think the team kind of was missing, because cArn was, as you say, an IGL type of player. GudeN was like an upper type of player, did a lot of fragging, but not the hyper type of guy. vilden and me was kind of similar in how we play the game. So we kind of missed something. We missed a walle or a hyper in that lineup for sure. Sad was also more like he was a rifler, but he was not the aggressive type.
Okay. So as we say, the results didn't really come for this team. Eventually, the project was abandoned, the team split apart. But there was a final sort of period that I wanted to ask you about, which is when you made this team. It was Raw Gaming, and it was where a bunch of you, in your case, it'd been a while since you'd been in the Eyeballers team. Most famously, this is when Hyper did a brief comeback.
Yes.
He came back for a little period of time because he'd gotten really disillusioned when he'd been in that NIP super team and it had just failed, basically. And he just straight up just quit CS. Even though actually at the time, he was considered one of the best players in the world. So it was kind of wild. So he did this little comeback. And what I remember about this squad was there was you and Hyper. You were the well-known players. The rest were unknown players. The team didn't really last very long or do very much. And in fact, the only player who went on from this team was a guy we didn't know at the time, who was called Alan, who later went on to SK and, later did have some success, etc. So how did this squad come about? Because I know from history, whenever a great player quits the game and then does a comeback, it's like they're just usually nostalgically remembering the good times, and they're like, oh, I'm going to do it again. But it's like whatever reason made them quit, it's probably going to get them again. It's soon enough.
Yeah.
As soon as they have a bad tournament or they realize this is way too much practice I'm going to need, they tend to just quit again. So was there some of that involved?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened, right? I think. I think we were kind of stretching a little bit in that lineup, and in that type of, I don't know, even trying that lineup was probably a little bit too hopeful. I think they were talented players. Hyrule and Allen was two of the upcoming players in Swedish Counter-Strike. They were that was before. I think maybe Fnatic had started. I don't know. No, maybe
Fnatic
not.
had just started at this point in time.
Yes. Yeah. Had they maybe brought in the other Archie guy?
Yes.
Because
he
they
was
were
on the same team, right? Gamers of the North.
Yeah. Because he was kind of the first new talented player that were brought in to the top level of Counter-Strike in Sweden. So they were kind of the pioneers in that way, that they were ready to try out pretty non-established players. And that's what we were trying to do in this team. So Hyrule and Allen was the two known talented players that were kind of accused online quite a lot for being a little bit too good. Okay. So that's why I decided that we will try them out for sure. I needed some consistency and some, type of, I needed an experienced player with me. That's when I introduced the opportunity for Hyper to reestablish himself, and that was with salary, and that was was pretty good timing. He was in between jobs or something like that, and he probably had realized that gaming was a pretty nice lifestyle compared to being on a static, boring job. So that's why he gave it a shot, but he wasn't really motivated. So it was like was stretching out a little bit too far, I think. And I had started playing poker on the side. and started earning some money on that. So I wasn't, putting in the hours as I used to either. And then the fifth player was
Hib.
Hib, yeah. He was a buddy with both Alan and Hyrule.
Right.
Prior to starting the lineup, he was probably the guy that wasn't seen as more talented than anyone else. He was probably the I don't know, lowest skilled player of that lineup.
Sure.
Or I mean, with the assumptions pre-starting it. So, and Hyrule, the problem with Hyrule, Alan actually, he became like a really good player, right, in the SK lineups. I remember vilden bringing him in. I don't know if it was him. I think it was. And because he saw some raw skill in him that he kind of developed in SK later on. Hyrule was just as skilled as Alan, but he had like the very, very self-destructive personality where he kind of bashed himself and the team when it didn't do good, So it was kind of toxic to play with, and that's why that team didn't succeed, I would say. And I mean, I was kind of, I was on my way out too, I think. So I wasn't at my best either.
Actually, yeah, as you referenced, there obviously was another player at this point in time called Archie, except he didn't have the E on the end of his name. It just ended in an I.
Yep.
Now, obviously, I would say, people might mistake you for him, but to be fair, actually, he was only in Fnatic for a couple of years, and then he actually had, his career just ended at that point in time, and he made way for some other players.
Yep.
In that team, from what I remember, he wasn't one of the best players in the Fnatic team. He was all right. Yep. You were the best Archie, right?
I would say so. but I mean, yeah, I mean, I think at least, it depends. It's kind of like, how do you value a player in Counter-Strike? It's like,
sure.
it's like soccer and hockey and all that, all the strikers gets the headlines, right? I think if looking back to it, and actually what you need today, I think I had that when I was, during my era, when it wasn't measured as valuable as it is today. So I think maybe I don't know if he was more of a fragger. I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on his playing style, I think. But I would say that I understood the concept of Counter-Strike in a way where, there's, I don't know. I think, I don't want to sound too self-promoting here, but I think there were a limited number of guys that understood the whole spectrum of how to play Counter-Strike, I think. And I was one of them that understood that. So in that sense, I think I was the better of the two Archies, but I don't know him too well. Obviously, he played in a successful Fnatic, so he must have been really good. But I didn't play against him. I don't think I've ever met him either. So I mean, I guess that's my take on it.
Right, since, as you said, when the team came up as eyeballers, it was actually one of the things everyone even commented on, it's not the team's just got the craziest fraggers ever and they're just outskilling everyone. Clearly it was a team that had tactics and had a good style and kept the same core for a long time and then was selective with which players he brought in. But as a result, people still will look at the scores and they will say stuff like, right, Hyper's the star player or whatever. So as a result, the order that people left the team, it made sense. Hyper went first and then vilden went and joined him and, went like this. So in general, it's understandable if some of the other players didn't get the crazy offers to go and join him. And you're saying here with bullen, you had a possibility once to join SK. Right, since you only really had the eyeballers part of your career was the successful part and when you had the years at the top, do you ever wonder what it would have been like to just be like all the other players and just go to whatever the best team that gives you the offer is or play in a different type of a team?
Yeah, I not every day, but I think I've been thinking about the scenario where because back in the days when I and vilden played with Rhythm, which was the team we played with prior to eyeballers, I had always been the star player. Even together with vilden, I was the fragger. I was the guy that got the 15 plus frags and all this on both sides every scrim.
Okay.
I was the guy that was together with vilden accused for cheating a lot. I shot through walls when no one else did, stuff like that. So it's kind of early on in that sense, using game sense to my advantage, you know. So I think if I would have had a personality where I was a little bit more aggressive, I probably could have become more of a top-rated player in the general sense of Counter-Strike, you know, where everyone else is valuing it, you know.
Yes.
So that would probably have made my career a little bit different and probably pushed me to play longer, I think. Now it became, you know, I started getting good at poker instead, so it came like a pretty obvious, you know, transformation going towards that instead. So I wasn't, you know, feeling that I felt like I was done with Counter-Strike. It was a perfect timing for me. But yeah, just being more aggressive, taking up a little bit more space would probably have changed my career a little bit, I think.
So if people see on the screen right now in this interview your Twitter name, it has PUBG in it. It doesn't say Archie CSGO or whatever, you know. So is this just, do you just play PUBG for fun? Are you actually moving into the competitive side of that? What's the situation with Archie now in 2018?
Yeah, so actually I was actually at an event in Seattle. That was my first competitive PUBG event. Qualified for that. Came third in the group stage. There were 80 teams in Seattle and divided into two groups, and we came third in the group stage. And then we actually had some bad circles and didn't play our best in the finals. We got 17th. But that was, I mean, a lot of good players were there, and we kind of scrim under the name of Eyeballers together, me, vilden, and an old Quake 3 player called Desp. He played for Eyeballers.
Yeah, also Eyeballers, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a new guy called Siempre. So we're kind of try-harding, but we're not like playing 6 days a week like we did Counter-Strike, you know. But we play 6 days a week, but we don't do it as a team 6 days a week, you know, because people have families. It's a little bit harder to make everything work. But I think this half seriousness is there because we have like an idea. If the opportunity arises, we will take it, you know. We have the opportunity in our lives to do it again. And we kind of want to prove, even though we're like 30 plus now, that especially in PUBG, where experience is kind of awarded a little bit more than raw talent, you know, that we can do it even though being kind of old, you know.
Okay.
So I would say that we're definitely tryharding, and we're definitely feeling that we can soon measure up with I mean, not if the best teams in the world, at least, you know, close to it, I think.
So okay, back in the day, at least, a lot of people who played Counter-Strike would have considered themselves like hardcore gamers, you know, like they only like games that are really difficult or skilled or whatever. And even though, as we're saying, PUBG is developing an esports side, because it actually got popular for casual play, it was popular because it's fun and anyone can just play, and, you know, the bad player can play and a good player can play, and there's a lot of crazy things can happen, and people like how exciting it is. What do you like about PUBG? What attracts someone who used to be a hardcore player a long time ago?
Yeah, so the concept of PUBG is, one, it's a new game, right? So you're kind of starting from scratch. Everyone is starting from scratch, and that's where you don't need to rebuild your skill level. For example, if I were to go into CSGO right now, I would probably need almost 2 years of playing 6 hours a day to even get up in the same type of skill, you know, raw skill as the other players have. They aim so ridiculously good today. They shoot so hard. And I don't even know if you have a chance to get into that scene again because it's so competitive, right? So obviously that's one of the key points of trying it out in PUBG, because the amount of time is going to be less than in CSGO. Also, as I was, you know, talking about, it awards experience in another way. It awards tactical advantage in a way, kind of like CS, where the scene is quite immature because it's made up of 20-year-olds who doesn't understand the concept of strategy and tactics in a way that we do, that are older, and we can use that quite dominantly in PUBG. So I think we actually saw that there's an edge to be made, even though you're not the best aimer in the world in PUBG. So I think that's what kind of, attracts us in terms of trying it out. Also, I mean, there's a random factor, which is, both good and bad in PUBG. You can, I think that's what they need to do something about. They need to even it out. They need to find a competitive environment where they award aggressiveness way more than they do today, because now there's a lot of gentleman agreements. People are jumping different spots on the map where you don't touch each other until it's late game. I mean, that's kind of like a pretty boring observer mode if you don't see people shooting at each other until late game. But yeah, it's the awarding the experience type of players a little bit more than maybe. I mean, CS:GO does that too, but I think you can probably get into a pretty good team just on shooting hard, and then you develop these extra skill sets. So I think in PUBG it gets awarded a little bit earlier. That's what I think is what's fun about it. Just that it's an immature scene that you can kind of get into. For us that haven't gamed at all or been gaming at all. I haven't been gaming for 12 years. It's kind of a pretty good opportunity to get into it again. And you kind of realize that the passion is there still. You just need to have a competitive environment to kind of enlighten it, I think. Okay,
so at the end of this interview, do you have a message for people, someone you want to thank or say hello to maybe?
I mean, everyone who knew me back then, it would be great to, especially if you're playing PUBG. I mean, it would be great to get in touch with you. I think doing this with vilden still is also a nice part of everyday life now. We've been kind of just combining the same passion as we had before. It's meant a lot for me. I'm sure it does for him as well. So just nice to get in touch with the esports world again. So if anyone wants to do that, they can hit me up. I mean, this was a nice opportunity. Just talking about the past. I mean, just you being interested in the career is a nice thing for me, I think.
Sure. Tack så mycket.
Tack så mycket.
This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Dean Tanglis, J Dobbs, Nate DOGG, Tobias Bernasconi, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA. Do you want teasers? Who are the guests on the upcoming talk shows, interviews I have? Maybe you want to take part in one of those Patreon donator discussions with me. Well, for any of the above perks and more, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.